The microphone sat on the desk, like a loaded gun. Lou Reed stared at it through his dark sunglasses, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming on the armrest of the studio chair. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 1982, and the DJ across from him, a young, eager voice named Marcus Webb, had no idea he was about to cross a line that would end the interview in less than 3 minutes. The red on-air light glowed above them, and somewhere in New York City, thousands of radio listeners were tuning in to hear the man behind Walk on the Wild Side talk about his new album, The Blue Mask. But what they were about to witness instead was a moment of raw, unfiltered pain, a glimpse into the wounds Lou Reed had spent decades trying to hide. Because when Marcus Webb asked his question, he didn't just touch a nerve. He detonated 23 years of buried trauma. The question was simple, almost casual. But for Lou Reed, it was a betrayal. And the way he responded, standing up without a word, ripping off his headphones, and walking out of the studio while the tape kept rolling, would become one of the most infamous moments in rock radio history. Years later, Marcus Webb would say he regretted that question every single day. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. And the world had seen, for just a few seconds, the man Lou Reed had been fighting his entire life to forget. If you want to hear more untold stories about Lou Reed and the dark truths behind rock's most iconic voices, subscribe to this channel now. You won't want to miss what comes next. To understand what happened in that radio studio in 1982, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the glory days of the Velvet Underground or the glittering chaos of Andy Warhol's factory, but to a hospital room in 1959, where a 17-year-old boy named Louis Allen Reed was strapped to a table while doctors prepared electrodes. His mother and father stood outside, believing they were doing the right thing. Their son was different. He liked boys. He wrote strange poetry. He listened to jazz records at 3 a.m. and talked about things that made them uncomfortable. So they took him to the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, where the doctors promised they could fix him. The treatment was called electroconvulsive therapy. Lou Reed would later describe it as the most violent, dehumanizing experience of his life. They put metal clamps on his head. They sent electrical currents through his brain. They told him it was for his own good. And when he came home weeks later, something inside him had changed forever. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and deep in his eyes there was a rage that would never fully go away. Lou Reed never forgave his parents for what they did. In interviews throughout his life, he would hint at it, sometimes bitterly, sometimes with dark humor. But he almost never spoke about it directly. It was too painful, too personal. And when people asked him about his childhood, he would deflect, change the subject, or simply shut down. This is what Marcus Webb didn't understand when he prepared for the interview that day. He had read an article, a vague reference to Lou's time in psychiatric treatment, and he thought it would be an interesting talking point. He thought Lou might open up about it. He thought, perhaps, that enough time had passed. He was wrong. The interview started normally enough. Marcus asked about The Blue Mask, the album Lou had just released. It was a departure from his earlier work. Raw, honest, stripped down. No synthesizers, no theatrics. Just Lou, his guitar, and his words. Critics were calling it his most personal album in years. Lou seemed relaxed, almost friendly. He talked about the recording process, about working with guitarist Robert Quine, about how sobriety had changed his perspective. He even cracked a joke. Marcus thought the interview was going well. He leaned forward, smiled, and then asked the question. Lou, I read somewhere that you underwent some kind of psychiatric treatment when you were younger. Electroshock therapy, I think? Can you talk about that? How did that experience shape your music? The silence that followed was suffocating. Lou Reed didn't move. He didn't blink. For 5 full seconds, an eternity on live radio, he just stared at Marcus through those dark glasses. His hand, which had been resting casually on the desk, slowly curled into a fist. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He knew immediately that he had made a mistake, but it was too late to take it back. The question was out there, hanging in the air like smoke, and Lou Reed's face, which had been open just moments before, was now a mask of stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" Marcus stammered. I thought, since the album is so personal, maybe you'd want to." Lou stood up. The scrape of the chair against the floor was loud in the quiet studio. He pulled off his headphones and set them down on the desk with a deliberate, controlled motion. Then, without looking at Marcus, without saying another word, he walked toward the door. Marcus called after him. "Lou, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" But Lou Reed was already gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Marcus was left sitting alone in the studio, the microphone still recording dead air. The interview had lasted less than 3 minutes, and somewhere in New York City, thousands of listeners sat in stunned silence, wondering what they had just heard. What Marcus Webb didn't know, what almost no one knew in 1982, was that the electroshock treatments Lou Reed endured at 17 had left scars far deeper than anyone could see. They weren't just memories. They were intrusions, recurring nightmares that haunted him for decades. Lou rarely spoke about them publicly, but those close to him knew. His first wife, Betty Kronstad, would later recall nights when Lou would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced he was back in that hospital room. He would describe the smell of antiseptic, the cold metal of the electrodes, the way his body convulsed as the current surged through him. He would talk about how, after the treatments, there were gaps in his memory, days and weeks that simply vanished. And worst of all, he would talk about the feeling of betrayal, the knowledge that the 2 people who were supposed to protect him had instead handed him over to strangers who hurt him in the name of healing. The treatments were supposed to cure him of his attraction to men, to make him normal, to erase the parts of himself his parents found shameful. But all they did was teach him that the world was not safe, that love was conditional, and that the people who claimed to care about you could also be the ones who destroyed you. This was the foundation of Lou Reed's worldview, the lens through which he saw every relationship, every collaboration, every moment of vulnerability. He built walls around himself, thick, impenetrable walls made of sarcasm, aggression, and emotional distance. And when someone tried to get too close, when they asked questions that felt like an invasion, he didn't hesitate to shut them out completely. This is what happened with Marcus Webb. The question wasn't just insensitive, it was a violation. It was Marcus reaching into the most painful part of Lou's past and dragging it into the open, into the light of a live radio broadcast, without warning and without permission. But there was more to Lou's reaction that day than just the trauma of the electroshock treatments. By 1982, Lou Reed was in a fragile place emotionally. He had just come out of years of heavy drug use, heroin primarily, which he had used to numb the pain of his past and the chaos of his present. He had been clean for a little over a year, and sobriety was hard. It meant feeling everything he had been avoiding for so long. It meant confronting memories he had tried to bury. And it meant dealing with the wreckage of his personal life, which included the end of his relationship with Rachel, the transgender woman he had loved more deeply than anyone before or since. Rachel had left him in the late 70s, and Lou was still processing that loss. The Blue Mask was, in many ways, a response to that loss, an attempt to make sense of love, pain, and identity without the haze of drugs to soften the edges. So when Marcus Webb asked about the electroshock treatments, he wasn't just reopening an old wound. He was asking Lou to explain the very thing that had broken him, the thing that had set him on a path of self-destruction that had nearly killed him. And Lou Reed, who had spent his entire adult life trying to control his narrative, trying to be seen as an artist rather than a victim, simply couldn't do it. Not on live radio, not with a stranger, not then. Lou Reed's response that day in the studio wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a defense mechanism he had honed over decades. Throughout his career, Lou had a reputation for being difficult, hostile, and impossible to interview. Journalists dreaded talking to him because he was unpredictable. Sometimes he would be charming and witty. Other times he would snap at the simplest question, shut down, or storm out. There was a famous interview in 1975 where a reporter asked him about his drug use, and Lou responded by staring at him in silence for a full minute before saying, "Next question." There was another in 1979 where a critic suggested that his music was depressing, and Lou replied, "Maybe your life is depressing. Don't put that on me." And there were countless smaller moments, snide remarks, sarcastic jabs, cold glares, that left interviewers feeling like they had done something wrong without knowing what it was. But people who knew Lou understood that this wasn't arrogance or cruelty. It was self-protection. Lou Reed had learned early on that vulnerability was dangerous. When he opened up, when he let people see the real him, they hurt him. His parents had hurt him by sending him to that hospital. His bandmates in the Velvet Underground had hurt him by leaving the group. Andy Warhol, who Lou had once idolized, had hurt him by treating him like a prop rather than a person. And Rachel had hurt him by leaving, even though Lou knew deep down that he had driven her away with his jealousy, his addictions, and his inability to show her the love she deserved. Every time Lou let someone in, they left, or they betrayed him, or they used him for their own purposes. So he stopped letting people in. He built his walls higher and thicker. And when someone tried to breach those walls, like Marcus Webb did in 1982, Lou didn't just push back. He cut them out completely. This is why The Blue Mask was such a surprising album for those who knew Lou's history. It was vulnerable in a way he had never been before. Songs like The Gun and My House dealt explicitly with themes of fear, anger, and self-reflection. In Underneath the Bottle, Lou sang about the emptiness of addiction and the struggle to find meaning without it. And in Waves of Fear, he described the lingering trauma of his past, the way it followed him like a shadow no matter how far he ran. The album was, in many ways, Lou's attempt to reconcile with his demons, to look them in the eye and admit they existed. But there was a difference between writing about your pain in the safety of a recording studio and talking about it live on the radio with a stranger. The former was controlled, curated, filtered through the lens of art. The latter was raw, immediate, and unpredictable. And Lou Reed, who had spent his entire life trying to maintain control, couldn't handle it. After Lou Reed walked out of the studio, Marcus Webb sat in stunned silence for several seconds, before realizing the microphone was still on. He cleared his throat, mumbled an apology to the listeners, and quickly cut to a commercial break. When the show resumed, he played a few tracks from The Blue Mask and wrapped up the segment without mentioning the incident. But the damage was done. Within hours, word had spread through the New York music scene. Lou Reed had walked out of a live radio interview. People were talking. Some found it hilarious. Typical Lou, always dramatic. Others were sympathetic, understanding that Marcus had crossed a line. But most were simply curious. What had the question been? Why had Lou reacted so strongly? And what did it say about the man behind the music? Marcus Webb spent the rest of the day replaying the interview in his head, trying to figure out where he had gone wrong. He had been so excited to have Lou Reed on his show. It was a career-defining moment, a chance to talk to one of the most influential artists of his generation. And he had blown it. That evening, Marcus called his producer and asked if they should reach out to Lou's management to apologize. His producer told him not to bother. Lou's probably already forgotten about it, he said. But Marcus couldn't forget. He kept thinking about the look on Lou's face, the way his entire body had gone rigid, the way his jaw had clenched, the way he had walked out without a word. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something deeper. It was pain. And Marcus felt terrible for causing it. Years later, in a 2009 interview, Marcus Webb finally spoke publicly about the incident. By then, Lou Reed's struggles with mental health and his traumatic childhood were more widely known. "I was young and stupid," Marcus said. "I thought I was asking an insightful question, something that would give listeners a deeper understanding of his work. But what I was really doing was forcing him to relive the worst moment of his life on live radio. I regret it to this day. If I could go back, I would never have asked that question. But I can't. And I have to live with that." As for Lou Reed, he never publicly addressed the incident. In the years that followed, he continued to do interviews, but he became even more guarded about his personal life. He would talk about his music, his artistic process, even his politics. But when it came to his childhood, his psychiatric treatment, or the deeper sources of his pain, he remained silent. The closest he ever came to acknowledging what happened in 1982 was in a 2003 interview with Rolling Stone, when a journalist asked him if he found it difficult to talk about his past. Lou paused, took off his sunglasses, and looked directly at the interviewer. "Some things," he said, "are not meant to be public. Some things you keep for yourself, because if you don't, they stop being yours. They become entertainment. And I've never been interested in being someone else's entertainment." The journalist didn't press further. He knew better. But the 1982 radio walkout wasn't the only time Lou Reed's trauma-driven defensiveness manifested in a public confrontation. There was another incident, one that fewer people know about, that happened just a few months earlier in late 1981. Lou had been invited to a small, private dinner in London hosted by a mutual friend. David Bowie was also on the guest list. The two had a complicated history. Bowie had produced Lou's Transformer album in 1972, which became Lou's biggest commercial success. But their relationship had soured over the years due to creative differences, ego clashes, and Lou's growing resentment toward anyone he felt had more control over his career than he did. At the dinner, Bowie made a comment, something light, maybe even affectionate, about how Lou had changed since the Transformer days, how he seemed more introspective now. Lou took it the wrong way. He heard it as Bowie implying he had been broken, fixed, or somehow less authentic back then. Lou stood up from the table, pointed at Bowie, and said, "You don't know a damn thing about me. You never did." The room went silent. Bowie tried to defuse the situation, saying he meant it as a compliment, but Lou was already grabbing his coat. He left the dinner without finishing his meal, and he and Bowie didn't speak again for nearly a decade. This pattern of walking out, of shutting down, of cutting people off when they got too close, was a survival mechanism Lou had developed as a teenager. It was how he protected himself, but it was also how he isolated himself. And by the early 80s, Lou Reed was more isolated than he had ever been. Rachel was gone. Most of his old Velvet Underground bandmates wanted nothing to do with him, and his reputation in the music industry was that of a brilliant but impossible artist, someone you admired from a distance but never got too close to. The irony was that Lou's music was all about connection. His songs explored love, loneliness, identity, and the human need to be seen and understood. But in his personal life, Lou Reed made sure no one got close enough to truly see him, because the last time someone had seen him, really seen him, vulnerable and scared and broken, they had sent him to a hospital and tried to erase the parts of him they didn't like. And that was a betrayal Lou Reed never got over. The recording sessions for the Blue Mask in late 1981 were intense and emotionally draining. Lou worked with guitarist Robert Quine, a musician he deeply respected and one of the few people he trusted in the studio. Quine later described the sessions as some of the most honest and raw he had ever been part of. Lou was exercising something, Quine said in a 1985 interview. You could feel it in the room. He wasn't just making songs. He was purging. One night, during the recording of Waves of Fear, Lou stopped in the middle of a take, took off his headphones, and sat in silence for 10 minutes. Quine and the other musicians didn't know what to do. Finally, Lou spoke. He said, "When I was 17, they tried to kill me. They didn't use a gun or a knife. They used electricity. And I've been carrying that around ever since." No one responded. They didn't know how. Lou put his headphones back on and finished the take in one flawless performance. It became the version that appeared on the album. This was the Lou Reed who walked into that radio studio in March 1982. He was sober, yes. He was making some of the best music of his career, yes. But he was also raw, exposed, and barely holding it together. The Blue Mask had stripped away all his defenses in the studio, and he didn't have the energy or the desire to put them back up in public. So when Marcus Webb asked his question, Lou didn't have a polite deflection ready. He didn't have a sarcastic comeback. He just had the truth. This is too painful to talk about. And rather than explain that, rather than give Marcus or the audience the satisfaction of an explanation, he simply left. Because walking away was the only form of control Lou Reed had left. What Marcus Webb and the listeners didn't understand in 1982 was that Lou Reed's entire career had been an act of defiance against the people who tried to break him. Every song he wrote about drag queens, drug addicts, and outcasts was a middle finger to his parents and the doctors who told him he was sick. Every time he wore makeup on stage or sang about transgender love or pushed the boundaries of what rock music could be, he was reclaiming the parts of himself they had tried to destroy. The Velvet Underground wasn't just a band. It was a statement. You cannot erase us. Transformer wasn't just an album. It was Lou Reed telling the world, I am exactly who you tried to cure me of being, and I am not ashamed. And the Blue Mask wasn't just a return to form. It was Lou finally admitting that the scars were still there, that the trauma hadn't gone away, and that maybe it never would. But admitting that in his music was one thing. Admitting it in person, to a stranger, on live radio, was something else entirely. And Lou Reed, for all his bravery and art, was still terrified of being vulnerable in real life. Because vulnerability meant risk, and risk meant potential betrayal, and betrayal meant pain. And Lou Reed had spent his entire adult life building a fortress around his pain to make sure no one could ever hurt him like that again. So when Marcus Webb innocently asked about the electroshock treatments, what he was really asking was for Lou to tear down that fortress on demand. And Lou couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Instead, he did what he always did when someone got too close. He walked away. The radio station received dozens of calls after the interview. Some listeners were angry at Marcus for being insensitive. Others were angry at Lou for being rude. A few defended Lou, saying he had every right to set boundaries. The station manager called Marcus into his office the next day and told him to be more careful in the future. But there were no serious consequences. Marcus kept his job. The incident faded from public memory within a week. But for Marcus, it never really went away. In every subsequent interview he conducted, he thought twice before asking anything personal. And whenever he played a Lou Reed song on his show, he felt a pang of guilt. Lou Reed, meanwhile, continued his career as if nothing had happened. He released more albums, toured the world, and remained one of the most respected and controversial figures in rock music. But people who worked with him in the years after 1982 noticed a change. He was even more protective of his privacy. He rarely did radio interviews, and when he did, his publicist would send a list of forbidden topics beforehand. Electroshock therapy was always at the top of the list. So were questions about his parents, his sexuality, and Rachel. Lou was drawing clear boundaries now, making sure no one could blindside him again, and for the most part, people respected that. Because by the mid-'80s, Lou Reed's reputation as someone you didn't mess with was firmly established. But there was another layer to Lou's emotional state in 1982 that Marcus Webb couldn't have known about: his unresolved grief over Rachel. Rachel was a transgender woman Lou had met in the early 70s, and their relationship was one of the most significant of Lou's life. He called her his soulmate. He wrote songs about her. He brought her on tour and introduced her to everyone as the love of his life. But the relationship was also turbulent. Lou's jealousy, his addiction, and his emotional instability made it difficult for Rachel to stay. By 1978, she had left him for good. Lou was devastated. He channeled that devastation into his music, but he never fully processed it emotionally. When he sat down in that radio studio in 1982, Rachel's absence was still a fresh wound. And when Marcus asked about the electroshock treatments, the thing that had shaped Lou's fear of intimacy, his inability to trust, and his tendency to push away the people he loved, he was essentially asking Lou to explain why he had lost Rachel. And that was a question Lou Reed didn't have an answer to. At least not one he was willing to share. By the time Lou Reed reached his 50s and 60s, his relationship with his past had softened somewhat. He married Laurie Anderson in 2008, and she brought a sense of peace and stability to his life that he had never experienced before. In interviews during this period, Lou seemed more relaxed, more willing to reflect on his career and his struggles. But even then, he never spoke in detail about the electroshock treatments. When asked directly, he would say something vague like, "It happened. It was a long time ago. I survived it." And that was all he would give. Laurie Anderson later said that Lou had talked to her about it in private, and it was clear the trauma still affected him. He would have nightmares, she said in a 2015 interview. He would wake up and not know where he was. The past never fully left him. He just learned to live with it. Lou Reed died in October 2013 from liver disease. In the weeks before his death, he spent time with Lori, practicing Tai Chi in their backyard and listening to music. He seemed at peace. But those who knew him best said there was always a part of Lou that remained unreachable, a part that had been damaged beyond repair by what happened to him at 17. The electroshock treatments had taken something from him, not just memories, but a sense of safety in the world. And no amount of success, no amount of love, no amount of artistic achievement could give that back to him. The 1982 radio interview incident is now a footnote in Lou Reed's biography, a small moment in a long and complex life. But it's also a reminder of the cost of trauma, the way it lingers and shapes every interaction, every relationship, every moment of vulnerability. Lou Reed was one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. He changed rock music. He gave voice to people who had been silenced. He made it okay to be different, to be queer, to be broken. But he did all of that while carrying a pain he could never fully express, a wound that never fully healed. And when Marcus Webb asked his question that day, he wasn't just asking about a medical procedure. He was asking Lou to revisit the moment his life split in two, the moment he stopped being Louis Allen Reed, the boy his parents wanted him to be, and became Lou Reed, the artist who refused to be fixed. Marcus Webb never interviewed Lou Reed again, and Lou never spoke publicly about what happened in that studio. But the story endures as a testament to the invisible scars people carry, the battles they fight in silence, and the courage it takes to walk away when staying would mean breaking. Lou Reed walked out of that studio because staying would have required him to relive the worst moment of his life for the entertainment of strangers. And Lou Reed had spent his entire career refusing to let anyone use his pain for their own purposes. That was his rebellion. That was his art. And in the end, that was his legacy. If this story moved you, if it made you see Lou Reed in a new light, then you understand why we tell these stories. There are more untold truths, more hidden moments, more insights into the lives of the artists who shaped our culture. Subscribe to this channel to make sure you don't miss them. Because the real story is always deeper than the legend.